Before the laws, before the chains became permanent, before slavery in America hardened into something inherited and inescapable, there was one man whose punishment changed everything. His name was John Punch, and history tried to erase him, not because his story was small but because it was too powerful. In the early 1600s, the American colonies were still experimenting with labor, punishment, and race. Africans, Europeans, and indentured servants worked side by side, all bound by contracts, not by skin. Freedom, though delayed, was still imaginable. Then one moment shattered that fragile balance. One decision in a Virginia courtroom quietly rewrote the future of an entire continent. John Punch ran for freedom with 2 white servants. When they were captured, the punishment revealed a terrifying truth. The white men were beaten, their servitude extended. John Punch, the African, was sentenced to serve for life. No crime worse. No escape allowed. With that single ruling, the idea was born that blackness itself could be a life sentence. This was not just the destruction of one man's freedom, it was the first legal crack that turned temporary bondage into permanent racial slavery. No declaration, no announcement, just a judgment so cruel and calculated that it became a blueprint for centuries of oppression. John Punch did not build plantations. He did not write laws. He did something far more dangerous. He exposed how easily a system could decide who deserved to be free and who would never, and from his silence American slavery began. In the earliest decades of colonial America, the world that would later be defined by rigid racial slavery did not yet exist in its final form. The colonies were fragile experiments clinging to the edge of survival, short on labor, food, and certainty. Jamestown and other early settlements were not built on grand visions of empire but on desperation. Disease, starvation, and conflict with the land itself killed more settlers than any enemy. In this unstable environment, the idea of permanent race-based slavery had not yet hardened. Labor was a problem to be solved, not an ideology to be enforced. To meet the need for workers, the colonies relied heavily on indentured servitude. Poor Europeans, many of them English, Irish, or Scottish, signed contracts binding them to work for a set number of years in exchange for passage across the Atlantic, food, shelter, and the promise of freedom at the end of their term. These contracts were brutal, and many did not survive long enough to see freedom. But the system was legally temporary. The servant, at least in theory, was not owned for life. Time, not skin, defined the boundary of bondage. Africans began arriving in the colonies during this same period, and their status was not immediately clear. Some were treated similarly to indentured servants, working for a number of years before being released. Records from the early 1600s show Africans earning wages, owning property, testifying in court, and even gaining freedom. The law had not yet fully decided what an African presence in the colonies meant. The category of black slave had not been formally invented. What existed instead was a fluid, unsettled labor system driven by economic need rather than racial doctrine. In the fields, workshops, and households, Africans and Europeans often labored side by side. They slept in the same quarters, ate the same rations, and endured the same punishments from overseers and masters. Hardship created a rough equality born not of justice but of shared suffering. A poor white servant and an African laborer could find themselves whipped for the same offense, or worked to exhaustion under the same sun. This closeness worried colonial elites, who feared cooperation and rebellion more than they feared cruelty. Class divisions mattered more than race in these early years. The true line was drawn between those who owned land and those who did not, between masters and laborers. Wealthy planters and colonial officials viewed all poor workers as disposable. Freedom was rationed carefully, controlled through contracts, debts, and violence. Race had not yet become the primary organizing principle of oppression, but the conditions were already forming beneath the surface. The absence of clear racial laws did not mean the absence of racism. European colonists carried prejudices with them, shaped by centuries of religious and cultural superiority. Africans were often described as outsiders, heathens, or inferiors, but these ideas had not yet been fully translated into permanent legal structure. Bias existed, but it had not yet been welded into the law with unbreakable force. That transformation required precedent, justification, and fear. Colonial courts played a powerful role in shaping this evolving system. Judges were not merely resolving disputes, they were defining social order. Each ruling set an example that others would follow. In a world without established legal tradition for the colonies, decisions were improvised, reactive, and often driven by the interests of the powerful. A single judgment could ripple outward, becoming custom, then expectation, then law. The economy was shifting as tobacco plantations expanded and profits grew. Large-scale agriculture demanded a labor force that was cheap, controllable, and permanent. Indentured servants, once freed, demanded land and rights. creating tension and instability. Former servants became competitors, not tools. The idea of a labor class that could never claim freedom, never own land and never challenge power became increasingly attractive to colonial elites. At the same time, interracial cooperation among servants frightened those in control. Runaways often fled together. Records show Africans and Europeans escaping side by side, sharing the same dream of freedom. This solidarity exposed a dangerous truth. Suffering erased racial divisions faster than ideology could build them. To maintain control, the ruling class needed a wedge strong enough to split poor laborers apart permanently. Law became that wedge. Gradually, punishments began to differ. Contracts were interpreted differently. Africans found their terms extended, their freedom delayed, their status questioned. Each small distinction nudged society closer to a new definition of bondage. What had once been temporary and conditional began to stretch toward permanence. Before slavery became hereditary, before children inherited chains at birth, the colonies existed in this unstable middle space, a world where freedom was limited but imaginable, where race influenced treatment but did not yet guarantee lifelong captivity. This fragile moment would not last. Economic pressure, fear of rebellion, and the desire for absolute control were pushing the colonies toward a darker, more rigid system. The transformation did not arrive with a single law declaring slavery eternal and racial. It crept in through courtrooms, contracts, and punishments. It emerged from decisions made quietly, often recorded in dry legal language that masked their brutality. The shift from shared hardship to racial hierarchy was not inevitable, but once set in motion, it accelerated rapidly. This was the world just before everything changed, a world where slavery was still being invented, where the meaning of blackness was still being defined by those in power, where one court ruling could tip the balance forever. John Punch emerges from history not as a fully documented individual with a recorded birthplace, family lineage, or personal testimony, but as a shadow shaped by fragments. What is known about him exists almost entirely because the colonial system chose to punish him in a way that set a precedent. His identity survives not through letters, diaries, or portraits, but through a single legal record that reduced a human life to a sentence. This absence is not accidental. Enslaved Africans were rarely allowed to leave behind personal traces, and the deliberate erasure of their voices became one of the foundations of the system that would follow. John Punch was an African man living in the Virginia colony in the early 17th century, a time when Africans were still being categorized, tested, and defined by colonial law. He is often described simply as a Negro, a label that stripped him of individuality while emphasizing difference. That word, used casually in court documents, carried with it assumptions about origin, status, and worth. His African identity placed him outside European norms in a society that was beginning to decide who belonged and who did not. Though the exact place of his birth is unknown, John Punch was almost certainly taken from West or Central Africa, regions heavily targeted by early Atlantic slave traders. He may have been captured in warfare, sold by intermediaries, or seized outright by European traders. His journey across the Atlantic would have been marked by violence, confinement, and death. Even in this early period before the transatlantic slave trade reached its later scale, survival alone suggests endurance, resilience, and an unrecorded strength that history refused to acknowledge. By the time he appeared in Virginia records, John Punch was already bound into the colonial labor system. His legal status is often debated by historians because it reflects the uncertainty of the era. He may have been considered an indentured servant, or he may have occupied a more ambiguous position between servitude and enslavement. What matters most is that his status was not yet defined as permanent or hereditary at the time. He existed in a moment when freedom, though fragile, was still theoretically possible. John Punch worked alongside European servants, performing the same grueling labor under the same oppressive conditions. Tobacco fields demanded relentless physical effort, long hours, and strict discipline. Overseers enforced obedience through violence, and escape was a constant temptation for those who could no longer endure the suffering. The shared environment blurred racial distinctions on the ground, even as those distinctions loomed in the minds of colonial authority. The name John Punch itself reflects colonial domination. John was a common English name assigned to Africans, often replacing their original names and identities. Punch may have been given arbitrarily, taken from a previous owner, or derived from a mocking or dismissive nickname. Names were tools of control, used to erase African heritage and reshape individuals into property or labor units, recognizable to English society. Whatever name he carried before it was lost to the record. His African identity made him visible and vulnerable in ways that white servants were not. Even before laws formally defined racial slavery, African laborers were viewed as more alien, more exploitable, and more easily dehumanized. Skin color became a visual marker that could not be escaped, unlike contracts that expired or debts that could be paid. This visibility made Africans ideal targets for harsher treatment when colonial authorities sought to set examples. John Punch's decision to flee reveals a critical truth about his humanity. He did not accept bondage as natural or deserved. He recognized injustice and acted against it, risking severe punishment for the chance at freedom. His escape was not a crime born of laziness or rebellion, but an assertion of self-ownership in a system designed to deny it. That choice alone challenges the narrative that early enslaved Africans were passive participants in their own oppression. When he was captured, John Punch was no longer just an individual in the eyes of the colony. He became a test case. His African identity transformed him into a symbol through which colonial authorities could experiment with punishment and control. His body became the site where law, race, and power intersected, and where a new definition of bondage could be imposed. Unlike the white men who escaped with him, John Punch had no racial shield to soften his sentence. His African origin marked him as different enough to justify an entirely separate fate. The court did not need to explain its reasoning in detail. His blackness was explanation enough. In that moment, identity itself became evidence. The silence surrounding John Punch's inner life is one of the most haunting aspects of his story. We do not know his thoughts as he worked, as he ran, or as he stood before the court. We do not know whether he had a family, loved ones, or dreams beyond freedom. What survives is the system's voice, not his own. Yet that silence speaks volumes about the violence of erasure that defined African existence in colonial record. John Punch represents countless Africans whose names never appeared in any document at all. He stands in for those whose lives were shaped by the same forces but whose punishments did not happen to create legal precedent. His identity matters not because he was unique, but because his experience was shared by many who left no trace behind. In remembering John Punch as an African man rather than just a legal footnote, the focus shifts from law to humanity. He was not born a symbol or a precedent. He became one through injustice. His African origins, his labor, his resistance, and his punishment together reveal the moment when identity itself began to determine destiny in America. The indentured servitude system formed the backbone of early colonial labor long before racial slavery became fully entrenched. It was a system born out of desperation on both sides of the Atlantic. In Europe, poverty, unemployment, debt, and overcrowded prisons pushed thousands of people toward contracts that promised passage to the New World. In the colonies, land was abundant but labor was scarce, and survival depended on bodies willing to work fields, build settlements, and endure conditions few could tolerate for long. Indentured servants entered into written agreements that bound them to a master for a fixed number of years, usually between 4 and 7. In exchange, the master provided transportation, food, clothing, and shelter. At the end of the term, the servant was supposed to receive freedom dues, often including clothing, tools, or land. On paper, the arrangement appeared transactional and temporary. In practice, it was brutal, exploitative, and often deadly. Servants had almost no legal protection during their contracts. Masters controlled every aspect of their lives, including movement, labor, punishment, and personal relationships. Beatings were common, food was minimal, workdays stretched from dawn until nightfall. Illness was frequent, and medical care was rare. Many servants died before their terms expired, making freedom a promise that existed more as an idea than a reality. The law treated indentured servants as property for the duration of their contract. They could be bought, sold, or transferred, just like livestock, as long as the remaining years of service were honored. Marriage required permission. Pregnancy could result in extended service to compensate the master for lost labor. Running away was considered a crime, punishable by whipping, branding, or the addition of extra years to the contract. Despite these conditions, indentured servitude differed fundamentally from slavery in one crucial way: it was not meant to be permanent. A servant's bondage was defined by time, not identity. No matter how harsh the treatment, the law recognized an eventual endpoint. This distinction mattered deeply because it meant that freedom was theoretically attainable, and that the servant's children were born free. Africans in early colonial America were often absorbed into this same system, at least initially. Some arrived as indentured servants, others as ambiguous laborers whose status was not clearly defined. Court records show Africans completing terms of service, receiving land, and participating in colonial life as free individuals. This overlap created a labor force in which race did not yet rigidly determine legal fate. European and African servants worked side by side in tobacco fields, kitchens, and construction sites. They shared exhaustion, punishment, hunger, and resentment toward their masters. This proximity fostered cooperation and at times solidarity. Servants ran away together,
plotted resistance together and sometimes married across racial lines. These alliances alarmed colonial elites, who feared uprisings more than they feared injustice. From the perspective of the ruling class, indentured servitude was unstable. Once freed, former servants demanded land and rights, swelling the population of poor but legally free people. These newly freed individuals competed with elites for resources and political influence. They also carried memories of exploitation, making them dangerous critics of colonial authority. The system also proved economically inefficient in the long term. Masters invested years of food, shelter and supervision into servants who would eventually leave. Each freed servant represented a loss of control and a potential rival. As plantations expanded and profits increased, elites began to seek a labor force that could be controlled for life, whose children would also be bound, and whose freedom would never become a political issue. This economic pressure intersected with existing prejudice. Africans, visibly different and already viewed as outsiders, became convenient targets for a new form of permanent bondage. The flexibility of indentured servitude made it vulnerable to manipulation. Contracts could be extended, terms reinterpreted, and punishments unevenly applied. What began as a temporary labor system slowly became a testing ground for permanent enslavement. Courts played a critical role in this transition. Judges were tasked with resolving disputes between masters and servants, and their decisions shaped the meaning of contracts and punishment. When servants ran away, the courts decided how severely they would be punished and whether their terms would be extended. Over time, racial distinctions began to creep into these rulings, even when the written law had not yet caught. White servants who escaped were typically punished with added years of service or corporal punishment, but their eventual freedom remained intact. African servants increasingly faced harsher consequences, longer extensions, and vague rulings that left their status uncertain. Each unequal decision weakened the temporary nature of servitude for Africans while reinforcing it for Europeans. Indentured servitude also taught colonial authorities how to control labor through violence, surveillance, and legal dependence. Techniques perfected on servants were later applied more systematically to enslaved Africans. Whippings, passes, patrols, and public punishments were not inventions of slavery but evolutions of servitude discipline. The language used to describe servants reveals how close the system already was to slavery. Servants were referred to as commodities, valued by age, strength, and remaining years. Their humanity was secondary to their utility. This mindset made the leap to lifetime ownership easier, especially when paired with racial difference. By the time John Punch lived and labored, the indentured servitude system was straining under its own contradictions. It promised freedom, but delivered suffering. It relied on control but produced resistance. It treated people as temporary property while fearing what they would become once free. These tensions created the conditions for a radical shift. Indentured servitude did not disappear overnight. It coexisted with slavery for decades, but its role diminished as racial bondage expanded. What remained was its legacy, a legal and cultural framework that normalized ownership of human labor, justified violence as discipline, and conditioned society to accept inequality as necessary for order. The transformation from indentured servitude to racial slavery was not a clean break, but a gradual mutation. The same fields, the same overseers, the same courts simply applied different rules to different bodies. Time-bound contracts hardened.
The escape attempt that brought John Punch into the colonial record began as an act of desperation shared across racial lines. He did not run alone. Two white indentured servants fled with him, bound by the same exhaustion, fear and hunger for freedom. Their decision to escape together reveals a moment when oppression outweighed difference, when survival mattered more than skin, and when the hope of liberty briefly united those the system would later work tirelessly to divide. Life under indentured servitude was relentless, and the temptation to flee was constant. Long hours in the fields, brutal punishments, inadequate food and the knowledge that years of suffering still lay ahead, pushed many servants to the edge. For John Punch and his companions, remaining meant continued degradation with no guarantee of survival. Escape, though dangerous, offered the only possibility of reclaiming control over their own bodies and futures. Running away in colonial Virginia was not a spontaneous act. It required planning, courage and a willingness to face extreme consequences. Servants who fled risked capture, violent punishment and extended servitude. Yet runaways continued to attempt it, again and again, which speaks to the unbearable nature of their bondage. That John Punch chose to run alongside white servants suggests shared trust and shared resolve forged through common suffering. The landscape itself shaped their attempt. Dense forests, swamps, Rivers and vast distances made escape both possible and perilous. Knowledge of the land was limited, and survival outside the plantation system required ingenuity. Food was scarce, shelter was uncertain. The threat of patrols and informants loomed constantly. Colonial authorities offered rewards for captured runaways, turning neighbors and strangers alike into potential hunters. Runaway servants often aimed for distant colonies, indigenous territories or ports where they might blend into new labor markets. Some hoped to pass as free workers, others simply sought distance from their masters, believing that anonymity might protect them. For Africans like John Punch, escape carried an additional risk. His appearance made concealment harder, and racial difference increased the likelihood of recognition and capture. Despite these dangers, interracial escape attempts were not uncommon in this early period. Servants lived, worked, and suffered together, and bonds formed naturally. Shared punishment erased illusions of privilege. Whips did not discriminate in the fields, and hunger flattened hierarchies. These alliances terrified colonial elites, who recognized that cooperation among the oppressed threatened the entire labor system. The decision to flee together challenged emerging ideas about race and status. It suggested that Africans and Europeans could see each other as equals in struggle, not as natural enemies. This possibility undermined the logic that would later justify racial slavery. If poor white servants identified more with African laborers than with wealthy masters, the system risked collapse. Their escape did not succeed. The details of how they were captured are sparse, but capture itself was common. Surveillance networks were well established, and patrols were motivated by financial reward and social obligation. Once caught, runaways were dragged back in chains, their brief taste of freedom replaced by the certainty of punishment. The return of John Punch and his companions to colonial custody transformed their personal act of resistance into a public legal matter. Escape was not merely a breach of contract, it was an offense against the social order. The colony needed to respond decisively, not only to punish the individuals involved, but to deter others who might follow their example. What happened next exposed the fragile nature of equality within servitude. Though the three men committed the same act, their identities would determine their fates. The court treated the escape as an opportunity to clarify boundaries that had previously been blurred. It became a moment to assert control, redefine punishment, and signal who could be forgiven and who could not. For the two white servants, the law viewed escape as a violation, but not as a transformation of status. Their punishment was meant to hurt, not to permanently redefine their existence. For John Punch, the escape would become a turning point that altered his life irrevocably. The same act of resistance would be interpreted through a different lens, one shaped by race and fear. The escape itself became evidence in a broader experiment. Colonial authorities were testing how far they could go, how much punishment could be imposed without formal law to support it, and how racial difference could be used to justify unequal treatment. John Punch's participation in the escape gave the court an excuse to draw a line that had not yet been fully drawn. This moment revealed the power of fear within the colonial system. Masters feared losing labor. Officials feared rebellion. Elites feared unity among the poor. The sight of Africans and Europeans fleeing together struck at the heart of colonial control. To prevent repetition, the punishment had to be severe enough to fracture solidarity and discourage future alliances. The escape attempt also exposed the illusion of choice within indentured servitude. While contracts promised eventual freedom, the lived reality made that freedom feel distant and uncertain. Running away was not an act of lawlessness but a rejection of a system that had already abandoned its own promise. For John Punch, the escape was an assertion of humanity in a world that sought to reduce him to labor. It was proof that he understood freedom not as a legal abstraction, but as a lived necessity. That understanding would soon be used against him, transformed into justification for permanent bondage. The escape did not fail because the desire for freedom was wrong. It failed because the system was designed to crush that desire when expressed by certain bodies. The capture of John Punch and his companions was not the end of resistance, but a warning of what resistance would cost, especially for those whose identity made them easier to sacrifice. This single act of flight would echo far beyond the lives of the three men involved. It would become the trigger for a ruling that reshaped labor, race, and law in America. What began as a shared attempt to escape suffering would be remembered not for its courage, but for the punishment it made possible. The colonial Virginia court that tried John Punch and his two companions was not a neutral space governed by clearly defined law. It was an improvised instrument of authority in a young colony still inventing its legal identity. Judges were planters, officials, and elites, whose primary concern was maintaining order and protecting property, not delivering justice as it might be understood today. The courtroom reflected the priorities of those in power, and every ruling reinforced the social structure they depended on. When John Punch was brought before the court, the proceedings were brief and practical rather than deliberate.
There was no jury as later generations would recognize it, no extended arguments, and no concern for equal treatment. The facts were simple and undisputed. 3 servants had fled their master and were captured. The crime was escape. The real question was not guilt but consequence. Colonial law at the time provided guidelines for punishing runaway servants, but those guidelines were flexible and inconsistently applied. Courts had wide discretion, and judges often used punishment as a tool to send messages beyond the individuals involved. This trial was not just about 3 men, it was about deterrence, authority and control in a labor system already under strain. The presence of 2 white servants alongside John Punch forced the court to confront a choice it had previously avoided. If all 3 men were punished equally, it would reinforce the idea that servants, regardless of race, shared the same legal standing. That outcome threatened the emerging belief that Africans should occupy a fundamentally different place in colonial society. The court instead chose differentiation. The language of the court record reveals how casually this distinction was made. The white servants were identified by name and status, while John Punch was marked primarily by race. His identity as an African was not incidental. It was central to how the court framed its response. In the eyes of the judges, race provided justification for unequal punishment without the need for explicit legal reasoning. The white servants were sentenced to have additional years added to their indentures. This punishment, though severe, remained within the logic of indentured servitude. Their contracts were extended, not erased. Their eventual freedom was delayed but not denied. The law still recognized them as temporary laborers, whose bondage would end. John Punch's sentence was different in kind, not just degree. The court ruled that he would serve his master for the rest of his natural life. This decision severed him from the indentured system entirely, and placed him into a new category of permanent servitude. No end date, no freedom dues, no legal pathway out. What made this ruling extraordinary was not that it punished an African harshly, but that it did so without an established legal framework. There was no statute mandating lifetime servitude for Africans at that moment. The court created the punishment through interpretation and authority rather than law. This improvisation gave the decision enormous power, because it could now be cited as precedent. The court did not explain why John Punch deserved a lifetime sentence while the others did not. The absence of explanation is itself revealing. The judges assumed that the reasoning was self-evident. Blackness required no justification. Difference was enough. This silent logic would become one of the most dangerous features of American slavery. The trial also exposed the role of fear in shaping colonial justice. Runaway servants threatened economic stability, but interracial escape threatened something deeper. It suggested unity among the laboring class. The court's ruling was designed to fracture that unity by making the cost of resistance unequal. White servants could hope for freedom, Africans could not. By sentencing John Punch to lifetime servitude, the court sent a clear message to both masters and servants. Masters were assured that African labor could be controlled more completely. Servants were warned that solidarity across race lines carried extreme risk. The ruling weaponized race as a tool of discipline. The courtroom itself functioned as a theater of power. Punishment was public knowledge. Even if the proceedings were not widely attended, word of the ruling would spread through plantations and settlements. Fear was amplified through rumor and repetition. The law did not need to be written everywhere to be felt everywhere. John Punch had no legal advocate. He had no recognized right to defend himself, challenge evidence, or appeal the ruling. His voice, like those of most Africans in colonial courts, was irrelevant to the outcome. The trial was not a conversation but a declaration imposed from above. The court's decision also reflected economic calculation. Lifetime servitude eliminated the uncertainty associated with indentured contracts. It guaranteed a permanent laborer whose value increased over time. By binding John Punch for life, the colony tested a model that promised stability and profit. This ruling did not instantly create racial slavery across the colonies, but it marked a turning point. It demonstrated that courts were willing to impose permanent bondage based on race alone. Once that door was opened, it could not be easily closed. Subsequent laws would formalize what this trial had already made possible. The trial of John Punch was recorded in sparse unemotional language. There is no indication of debate, doubt, or the simplicity of the record contrasts sharply with the magnitude of its impact. A single sentence transformed a man's life, and reshaped the future of American labor. The courtroom in which John Punch stood was not aware that it was making history. It was responding to an immediate problem with a convenient solution, yet that convenience carried consequences far beyond the moment. The ruling became a reference point for later decisions, a foundation upon which a racial hierarchy could be legally constructed. John Punch left the courtroom not as a servant with extended punishment, but as a man legally condemned to die in bondage. His trial demonstrated how easily law could be bent to serve power, and how quickly identity could be converted into destiny through judicial authority. The unequal punishments handed down after the escape attempt revealed a truth that colonial society had not yet fully admitted but was already practicing. 3 men committed the same act, under the same conditions, with the same intent, yet the consequences diverged sharply along racial lines. This divergence was not accidental or incidental. It was a deliberate act that exposed how race was becoming a legal instrument, rather than a social observation. For the 2 white servants, punishment remained tied to time. Their sentences extended the years of their indentures, reinforcing the idea that their bondage was temporary, contractual and ultimately reversible. Pain and discipline were tools to correct behavior, not to permanently redefine their existence. Even in punishment, the law acknowledged their future freedom. John Punch's punishment broke from this logic entirely. His sentence erased time as a factor. Lifetime servitude did not extend his contract. It nullified the concept of a contract altogether. In one ruling, he was removed from the legal category of indentured servant, and placed into something far more absolute. This was not discipline, it was transformation. The contrast between these punishments revealed how race had begun to function as a legal shortcut. Instead of proving criminal intent, measuring harm or weighing circumstances, the court relied on identity. Blackness became a justification that required no explanation. The same behavior that warranted correction in white bodies justified permanent domination in a black one. This unequal treatment was a warning encoded in law. It told white servants that rebellion carried consequences but also limits. It told Africans that resistance could cost everything. The disparity was designed to fracture solidarity by attaching vastly different risks to the same act. Unity became dangerous when its price was unevenly distributed. The ruling also redefined punishment itself. For white servants, punishment remained finite. For John Punch, punishment became existence. His labor, his body and his future were converted into penalties with no expiration date. The line between punishment and identity disappeared. The absence of outrage or recorded dissent following this ruling suggests how readily colonial society accepted the logic of inequality. The court did not need to defend its decision publicly. Masters did not protest. Officials did not hesitate. The ruling aligned too closely with economic interests and emerging racial assumptions to be controversial among those in power. Unequal punishment served as a form of social education. It taught colonists how to interpret difference and how to behave accordingly. White servants learned that despite their suffering they were not at the bottom of the hierarchy. Africans learned that no amount of obedience could guarantee safety from permanent bondage. This disparity also laid the groundwork for future legal codification. Once courts demonstrated that unequal punishment was acceptable, lawmakers could formalize it. Statutes would later specify different penalties for Africans and Europeans. But those laws did not appear in a vacuum. They grew out of precedents like this one. The ruling against John Punch helped shift the focus of punishment from behavior to being. The crime was not simply running away. It was running away while black. This distinction transformed law into a mechanism for defining identity. Punishment no longer responded to actions alone but to who the person was perceived to be. Unequal punishment also reassured elite colonists that racial hierarchy could be enforced without constant violence. Law could do the work quietly, efficiently, and with the appearance of legitimacy. Courts could impose lifelong control without chains or whips in the moment, relying instead on legal authority to sustain domination over time. The psychological impact of such rulings extended beyond those directly involved. Africans throughout the colony would have understood the message clearly. Escape was no longer just risky, it was potentially final. White servants meanwhile were given a reason to distance themselves from African laborers, knowing that shared resistance could bring disproportionate consequence. This imbalance created a racialized gradient of punishment that would define American slavery for generations. Minor offenses committed by Africans would be met with extreme penalties, while similar actions by whites would be treated as correctable misbehavior. The legal system began to normalize disproportion as fairness. The unequal punishments also revealed the fragility of the idea of justice in colonial courts. Justice was not blind. It saw race clearly and used it decisively. Equality before the law was not an ideal being betrayed. It was an ideal that had never been intended for everyone. By treating John Punch's life as a sentence rather than a person, the court demonstrated how easily humanity could be overridden by utility. Lifetime servitude was efficient, profitable and enforceable. It solved multiple problems at once: labor shortage, deterrence, and racial control. This ruling encouraged masters to view African labor differently. A white servant represented a temporary investment. An African laborer could now be imagined as permanent property. This shift in perception would drive changes in purchasing, inheritance, and labor management, accelerating the expansion of slavery. Unequal punishment also functioned as historical erasure. By reducing John Punch to a sentence, the law stripped him of narrative agency. His story became an example rather than a life. Meanwhile, the white servants remained individuals within the legal record, defined by contracts and names rather than by permanent status. The decision signaled that law would not protect Africans from excess, but would enable it. Once courts demonstrated willingness to impose lifelong punishment without statutory backing, there was little barrier to further escalation. The logic of inequality had been tested and found useful. This moment marked the transition from shared exploitation to structured racial hierarchy. Punishment became the mechanism through which that hierarchy was enforced. The same whip, the same court, the same crime produced radically different outcomes, not because of law but because of race. Unequal punishment was not a side effect of early colonial justice. It was a foundational strategy. It taught colonists how to rank human worth.
The sentence that condemned John Punch to lifetime servitude was more than a punishment. It was a declaration that redefined what bondage could mean in America. Until that moment, servitude had limits, however cruelly enforced. Time functioned as the boundary between captivity and freedom. With a single ruling, that boundary was erased for one man, and in doing so, the court tested the possibility that bondage could last forever. Lifetime servitude was not simply a longer sentence. It represented a complete severing from the legal framework of indenture. An indentured servant existed within a contract, however unequal. That contract implied obligations on both sides, however rarely honored. By sentencing John Punch for life, the court removed him from any contractual relationship and placed him into a condition defined solely by ownership and permanence. This ruling introduced a new idea into colonial law, that a person could be bound not for what they did but for who they were perceived to be. John Punch's sentence did not reference years, repayment, or rehabilitation. It referenced existence. His labor, his body, and his future were now permanently claimed. Freedom was no longer delayed. It was denied outright. The phrase for the term of his natural life carried enormous weight. It meant that no behavior, no obedience, and no passage of time could alter his condition. Good conduct offered no relief. Survival itself became a continuation of punishment. Every day lived was another day owned by someone else. This sentence also eliminated legal uncertainty for John Punch's master. A servant whose term might expire represented risk. A servant bound for life represented security. The ruling transformed human labor into a predictable asset. This predictability would soon become the cornerstone of plantation economics. By imposing lifetime servitude through a court decision rather than a statute, the colony demonstrated how easily permanence could be normalized. What was extraordinary became ordinary through repetition. Once one African man could be sentenced for life, others could follow, even without explicit law to justify it. The ruling against John Punch also introduced the idea that African laborers could be excluded from the protections, however minimal, afforded to other servants. Courts had previously intervened in disputes over contracts, treatment, and term length. Lifetime servitude removed John Punch from that system entirely. There was nothing left to dispute. This sentence collapsed the distinction between punishment and stat. John Punch was not being punished, and then returned to normal life. His punishment was to become something different forever. He was transformed from a laborer with a term into a person without an end. The psychological impact of such a sentence cannot be overstated. To know that no future existed beyond labor was to exist without horizon. Hope itself became dangerous, because it had nowhere to land. Lifetime servitude was not only physical control but mental domination. The ruling also quietly introduced heredity as a future possibility. If a man could be bound for life, questions naturally followed about his children. Though not immediately resolved in law, the logic was already in motion. Permanence invites inheritance. Ownership seeks continuity. This sentence relied on silence as much as authority. There was no detailed justification, no moral reasoning recorded. The absence of explanation normalized the outcome. It suggested that lifetime servitude required no defense when imposed on an African body. Colonial officials did not view this ruling as radical. It aligned too neatly with economic needs and emerging racial assumptions. The lack of controversy reflects how ready the system was for such a transformation. The court merely articulated what many already believed should be possible. The sentence also functioned as an experiment. Could lifetime bondage be enforced without rebellion, without legal chaos, without resistance from other colonists? The answer, tragically, was yes. The system absorbed the ruling and moved forward. John Punch's life sentence became a reference point, whether explicitly cited or implicitly remembered. It demonstrated that courts could create slavery even before legislatures named it. Law did not need to catch up to practice. Practice was already reshaping. The ruling also reshaped the meaning of escape. For Africans, escape was no longer just a breach of discipline, it became an act that could justify permanent loss of freedom. The risk calculation changed entirely. Resistance carried an existential price. Lifetime servitude also erased the possibility of redemption. In other forms of punishment, suffering might lead to restoration. Here, suffering was the condition itself. There was no path back to personhood recognized by law. The sentence positioned John Punch outside the moral community of the colony. He was no longer a wayward servant to be corrected. He was a permanent outsider whose labor could be extracted without concern for future autonomy. This ruling marked a shift from exploitation to ownership. Exploitation abuses labor. Ownership claims it entirely. Lifetime servitude completed that transition in practice. If not yet in name, the permanence of the sentence also ensured invisibility. A man bound for life left fewer records because his legal status no longer changed. Contracts ended. Court cases closed. His life continued without documentation, swallowed by routine labor. By condemning John Punch to lifetime servitude, the court demonstrated how quickly a system could cross a moral boundary once it found the crossing useful. There was no return built into the decision, no safeguard, no limit. This sentence did not just define John Punch's fate, it introduced a model that others would refine, expand, and formalize. What began as a single ruling would soon harden into law, custom, and ideology. Lifetime servitude transformed time itself into a weapon. For John Punch, every future moment belonged to someone else. The law had reached into his entire remaining life and claimed it without appeal. This ruling made clear that bondage in America was no longer merely about labor contracts or punishment. It was becoming a system capable of total possession, justified through race and enforced through law. The ruling against John Punch did not remain an isolated act of cruelty confined to a single courtroom. It became something far more dangerous, a legal precedent. In a colonial system where written law was sparse and evolving, precedent carried enormous weight. Judges looked backward to justify future decisions, and what had been done once could be done again with less resistance. The sentence imposed on John Punch demonstrated that lifetime servitude for an African was possible, enforceable, and acceptable within colonial authority. Legal precedent functions quietly. It does not announce itself as revolution. It works through repetition and reference, through memory rather than proclamation. The ruling in John Punch's case showed other courts that they could impose permanent bondage without waiting for legislatures to act. The absence of backlash reinforced the lesson. If no one objected, the decision could be treated as normal. This precedent mattered because colonial law relied heavily on custom. Courts often justified rulings by citing what had been done before rather than what had been written. In that environment, a single case could reshape practice across an entire colony. John Punch's sentence offered a model that aligned law with economic desire and racial assumption. The precedent also resolved uncertainty. Before this ruling, the status of Africans in the colonies was ambiguous. Some were servants, some were enslaved, some were free. This ambiguity created legal friction. The ruling against John Punch cut through that uncertainty by demonstrating that African identity could be used to justify permanent servitude even in the absence of explicit statute. Once precedent existed, it could be extended. Other Africans accused of running away, resisting authority, or violating contracts could be punished more harshly than white servants. Courts no longer needed to invent justification from scratch. They could point, implicitly or explicitly, to what had already been done. This legal shift encouraged lawmakers to formalize what courts were already practicing. Statutes followed precedent, not the other way around. Over time, colonial assemblies passed laws defining slavery as lifelong and racial, but those laws rested on earlier judicial decisions that had tested and normalized the concept. The precedent also influenced how masters understood their authority. If courts were willing to impose lifetime servitude on Africans, masters could push boundaries with confidence. Discipline could be harsher, contracts could be ignored. The threat of permanent bondage became a tool of everyday control. The ruling transformed escape into a racialized offense. White servants who ran away were punished within the framework of indenture. Africans who ran away risked losing freedom entirely. This difference was not yet written into law, but precedent made it enforceable. Judges could rely on earlier rulings rather than personal discretion alone. Precedent also shaped expectations among the oppressed. Africans learned quickly and painfully that the legal system did not offer the same limits to their punishment. Hope became more dangerous. Resistance became more costly.
The law itself became an instrument of terror, not through constant violence but through the certainty of extreme outcomes. The ruling against John Punch helped shift the burden of proof. Instead of requiring the colony to justify why an African should be enslaved for life, the precedent implied that freedom required justification instead. Blackness moved from neutral status to presumptive bondage. This precedent blurred the line between law and race. Legal reasoning no longer needed to articulate why race mattered. It simply assumed that it did. That assumption hardened into practice, and practice hardened into law. The transformation was gradual but relentless. The influence of precedent extended beyond Virginia. Colonial officials communicated, migrated and shared legal ideas. What worked in one colony could be adopted in another. John Punch's case became part of a broader legal culture that increasingly accepted racialized slavery as both practical and lawful. Precedent also created inertia. Once a system begins to rely on a particular interpretation, changing it becomes difficult. Reversing a precedent requires effort, courage and opposition to entrenched interests. None of those forces existed in favor of Africans. The path of least resistance led forward, not backward. The ruling also redefined fairness within colonial justice. Fairness no longer meant equal treatment for equal actions. It meant predictable outcomes aligned with social hierarchy. Precedent ensured that inequality could be administered consistently, giving it the appearance of order. As precedent accumulated, it shaped legal imagination. Judges began to see Africans primarily through the lens of enslavement. Alternative interpretations became harder to conceive. The law did not just reflect reality, it trained those who practiced it to see reality in a particular way. The precedent set by John Punch's sentence contributed to the invention of racial categories within law. African became not just a descriptor of origin, but a marker of legal destiny. This transformation was subtle but profound. Identity became actionable. Precedent also insulated decision-makers from moral responsibility. Judges could claim they were following established practice, rather than making choices. Responsibility dissolved into routine. Cruelty became administrative. Over time, the accumulation of such precedents created a legal environment where racial slavery appeared inevitable rather than constructed. Each decision pointed backward to justify itself, forming a closed loop of authority. The ruling against John Punch stands at the beginning of that loop. It did not create American slavery alone, but it made slavery legible to law. It showed how a courtroom could convert racial assumption into binding reality. Legal precedent is powerful, because it persists even when the individuals involved are forgotten. John Punch's name faded, but the logic of his sentence endured. Courts continued to act on the idea that race could determine permanence. This precedent also ensured expansion. Once lifetime servitude was legally imaginable, it could be applied more broadly, more systematically, and eventually hereditarily. What was once exceptional became expected. The law did not pause to ask whether this precedent was just. It asked only whether it worked. And because it worked for those in power, it was repeated, reinforced, and refined. Through precedent, a single ruling became a foundation, not a moral foundation, but a legal one. It supported a structure that would grow larger, heavier and more entrenched with each passing decade. John Punch's sentence thus lived on not through his story but through its consequences. The precedent it established shaped how courts thought, how laws were written, and how human beings were categorized within American society. This was how slavery became legal before it became inevitable, how race became destiny before it became doctrine, how a single decision could echo through centuries without ever needing to be spoken aloud. The transformation from temporary labor to permanent bondage in colonial America did not happen overnight, nor was it a single event. It was a gradual evolution driven by economic pressures, social anxieties, and legal experiments, with John Punch's case standing as a critical turning point. Before his lifetime sentence, the system of indentured servitude had allowed for limits, however brutal, and the possibility of eventual freedom. Labor was measured in years, contracts defined obligations, and even the harshest punishment carried an endpoint. The ruling against Punch broke that pattern and signaled that a new form of servitude, unbounded by time, hereditary in consequence and racialized in enforcement, was possible. Colonial Virginia, like other early settlements, faced a chronic labor shortage. Tobacco cultivation, the colony's economic engine, required intense physical work. European indentured servants were finite in number, and their terms eventually expired, leaving planters to confront a recurring problem: how to secure a stable, lifelong labor force. African laborers offered an alternative, but at first their status was ambiguous. They could be servants, free persons, or in some cases enslaved. The system had yet to settle on a uniform approach, creating both opportunity and tension for colonial authority. The decision to impose permanent servitude on John Punch established the principle that African identity could justify a different legal treatment. Unlike white indentured servants, whose labor was contractual and temporary, Africans could be bound for life, creating a clear divergence that would influence social hierarchy and labor policy. What had been a fluid distinction between different laborers was now hardening into a categorical difference, enforced through the legal system. This shift laid the groundwork for a more expansive and systemic form of slavery that would soon codify itself across generations. Economic considerations played a significant role in this transformation. Permanent African laborers offered planters a reliable long-term workforce that could be leveraged for expanding plantation economies. There was no need to negotiate contracts or anticipate freedom. The investment in a permanent laborer promised returns not just in harvests, but in inheritance, property and social stability. Lifetime servitude converted human life into a predictable asset, reducing uncertainty for those with wealth and power. The psychological implications for the laborers themselves were profound. While white servants might endure years of harsh treatment with the knowledge that freedom awaited, Africans sentenced to lifelong servitude faced an entirely different reality. The hope of eventual liberation was removed, replaced by the knowledge that survival itself meant continued bondage. This created a system in which the very concept of freedom became conditional upon race, setting a template for the social and legal inequalities that would define the colonies for centuries. Racial distinctions became increasingly central to labor management. Masters and officials recognized that African and European laborers responded differently not because of ability but because of legal status and imposed expectation. Whites might resist discipline or attempt escape, but they were always contained within a system that promised relief. Africans, by contrast, were subjected to an absolute form of control with no legal recourse. This reinforced the perception that Africans were inherently suited to permanent servitude, a perception that would soon be codified in law. The shift from temporary to permanent labor also had a social dimension. Colonial authorities feared unity among the poor. When African and European servants escaped together, as John Punch had done, it highlighted the potential for cross-racial cooperation that threatened elite control. By punishing Africans more severely, the courts not only imposed discipline on individuals but also fractured potential alliances. Permanent bondage became a tool not only of labor exploitation but also of social engineering. Legal decisions following John Punch's case increasingly reflected this new logic. Courts could now justify harsher punishments for Africans based solely on precedent, gradually embedding the idea that race could dictate legal outcome. Even without formal statutes, the enforcement of lifetime servitude for Africans created a structural distinction that became self-reinforcing. Each ruling built upon the last, tightening the legal and social grip of racial hierarchy and expanding the reach of permanent slavery. The evolution from temporary to permanent bondage also had implications for the next generation. Although John Punch's ruling did not explicitly establish hereditary slavery, the logic of permanence naturally extended to children. If a man could be bound for life, his offspring became candidates for the same treatment. This concept of inherited servitude would soon become law, entrenching slavery across generations and ensuring that the labor force remained stable and predictable for colonial economics. Law and fear converged to make permanent slavery both desirable and enforceable. Planters needed labor they could control. The courts had shown that racialized punishment was acceptable, and the threat of rebellion or cooperation among laborers could be mitigated through unequal treatment. The system became self-reinforcing. The more permanent African bondage was imposed, the more it appeared natural, necessary, and inevitable. The social and legal structures surrounding temporary labor were themselves adapted to support permanent slavery. Contracts, once designed to measure time, were altered or ignored. Disputes over service could now be resolved through the lens of racial difference. Corporal punishment, extension of service, and the imposition of lifetime labor became tools not of correction but of control. The system evolved incrementally, with each adjustment further embedding racial hierarchy into the fabric of colonial society. Resistance, however, did not disappear. Africans continued to attempt escape, challenge authority, and assert agency despite the increased risk. Each act of resistance was met with more severe punishment, reinforcing the perception of Africans as permanently subordinate. Over time, fear and law combined to produce compliance, but the human impulse for freedom persisted, creating tension that would define the colonial experience. The transition from temporary labor to permanent bondage also affected how the colonies viewed justice. Legal reasoning shifted from correcting behavior to maintaining hierarchy. Punishment became a function of identity rather than action, and courts increasingly treated African laborers as property rather than as human beings capable of legal rights. This reorientation of justice legitimized extreme inequality and provided a framework for subsequent laws that would formalize racial slavery. Economic, social and legal pressures converged to make the transformation irreversible. Indentured servitude for Europeans continued for decades, but the model for Africans had fundamentally changed. Their labor became perpetual, their punishment unending, and their social status codified. This bifurcation of labor systems marked the birth of racial slavery as a structural institution in America. By the mid-17th century, what had begun as individual rulings and ad hoc decisions had coalesced into a broader framework. Colonial authorities recognized that lifetime African servitude was not only possible but advantageous. The system was reinforced through precedent, social expectation, and economic necessity. The change was subtle yet monumental. A single court decision, combined with systemic pressures, had transformed the nature of labor in the colony.
The erasure of John Punch from mainstream American history reflects a deliberate effort to obscure the origins of racial slavery, even as his case laid the foundation for the system that would dominate the colonies for centuries. While his lifetime servitude marked a turning point in the legal codification of African bondage, historical narratives largely ignored his existence, leaving him as a footnote rather than a central figure. This erasure reveals not only the marginalization of Africans in historical memory, but also the selective way in which history has been recorded, transmitted, and remembered in America. John Punch's story is emblematic of countless Africans whose lives were defined by law, labor, and punishment, yet who left no personal records to tell their own stories. The scarcity of documentation is not simply a coincidence. It reflects a system designed to minimize the visibility and agency of African laborers. Court records like the one that sentenced Punch to lifetime servitude focus on his status as property and as a laborer rather than as a person with thoughts, desires, and relationships. By reducing his identity to a legal category, the system ensured that the historical narrative would likewise minimize him. The marginalization of Punch in historical accounts underscores how the origins of American slavery are often sanitized or simplified. Many histories of the period focus on generalized patterns of labor or later codified laws without tracing the individual acts in court cases that established precedent. John Punch represents a critical moment in this story. He was the first documented African in the English colonies sentenced to permanent, hereditary bondage as a direct result of a judicial decision. Yet in the broader narrative of slavery's development, his name is rarely mentioned, and the significance of his case is frequently overlooked. The erasure of Punch's role also highlights the intersection of race and historical memory. Histories written by European colonists, later by American historians, and subsequently by mainstream education systems, have often centered white perspectives, achievements, and experiences. Africans, particularly those who lived in bondage before the full codification of slavery, were not only denied freedom but also denied visibility in the historical record. Punch's life, transformed into a precedent for oppression, was intentionally obscured, making him a forgotten man whose legacy shaped the lives of millions but whose name vanished from memory. This historical invisibility is compounded by the nature of early record. Legal documents recorded events in cold, procedural terms. A ruling against Punch exists in archives as a dry notation: his crime, the act of running away, and the resulting punishment. The human dimension, the fear, hope, resistance, and despair that defined his life is absent. For historians, reconstructing these dimensions requires inference and context, a difficult task when sources are scarce. Consequently, the story of John Punch is overshadowed by later, more documented figures in the history of slavery. The case of John Punch also challenges the perception of slavery as an inevitable, fully formed institution. His lifetime servitude represents a legal innovation, not a natural condition. By sentencing him to life based on race, the colonial court set a precedent that enabled the transition from temporary, contract-based labor to racialized hereditary slavery. The deliberate neglect of Punch in historical accounts obscures the contingency of this transformation. Slavery was not simply an economic necessity, it was constructed through legal and social decisions that could have gone differently. Punch's erasure has consequences beyond individual recognition. It obscures the mechanisms by which racial slavery was developed, including the incremental legal distinctions, selective punishments, and precedent-setting cases that allowed lifelong hereditary servitude to become normalized. Understanding Punch's case illuminates how the legal system functioned as a tool of racial oppression, demonstrating that slavery was built consciously through law and policy rather than emerging organically. The neglect of John Punch also diminishes the recognition of African agency in early colonial history. His escape attempt, shared with 2 white servants, was an act of resistance, a claim to freedom, and a refusal to accept subjugation. By sentencing him to lifetime servitude, colonial authorities aimed to suppress not only his individual resistance, but also the potential for solidarity between African and European laborers. The absence of his story from mainstream narratives minimizes the role Africans played in shaping the early legal and social landscape of the colonies through acts of defiance. Historical erasure of figures like Punch also reflects broader patterns of how oppressed peoples are remembered. In many cases, history privileges those who hold power or those whose stories are convenient to dominant narratives. John Punch's life inconvenient, because it demonstrates both African agency and the origins of a racially codified legal system, was omitted to maintain narratives that focus on European colonists' experiences and achievement. This omission reinforces a distorted understanding of how slavery developed, and whose labor and lives were instrumental to the colony's economic foundations. The marginalization of John Punch also affects contemporary understanding of racial inequality. Recognizing his role illuminates the deliberate creation of a racial hierarchy that was enforced legally, socially, and economically. Understanding that this system began with specific decisions, such as his sentencing, emphasizes that slavery and systemic racism were human constructions, not inevitable forces. Remembering Punch restores agency and accountability to those who built and benefited from the institution. Finally, John Punch's story represents a challenge to historians, educators, and society at large, to reconstruct the lives of those systematically erased from memory, to acknowledge the individuals who shaped history even when they were denied visibility, and to recognize the legal and social foundations of systemic oppression. His sentence was a turning point in American history, yet the man himself remains largely invisible. By studying, documenting, and teaching his story, historians can reconnect the human narrative to the legal and economic structures that followed, ensuring that the forgotten man is remembered for the enduring impact of his life and the precedent it set. John Punch's erasure is not simply a historical oversight, it is a reflection of the selective memory of American society, which preferred to focus on generalized systems or later figures rather than confront the specific human origins of racial slavery. Understanding his story reintroduces the personal into the structure, revealing how one man's life and punishment became a model for an institution that would dominate the lives of millions of Africans and their descendants in the centuries to come. The story of John Punch stands as a stark reminder that history is shaped, not just by those who hold power, but also by those whose lives challenge it. His lifetime sentence marked the birth of racialized hereditary slavery in America, yet for centuries his name was almost erased from memory. Remembering John Punch is not simply an act of historical correction, it is a recognition of the human cost behind the systems that built a nation. His courage, his resistance, and the injustice he suffered illuminate the roots of racial inequality and the legal structures that sustained. In honoring him, we confront the origins of a system that defined generations, acknowledge the humanity of those who were denied it, and reclaim a vital piece of the story that created the America we know today. The forgotten man may have been silenced by law, but his legacy continues.